Bolo'bolo by Hans Widmer. Gano. Bolo'bolo isn't only a way for the Ibu to conquer more time, but also a way to get more space. Gano. Shop roofs, garages, offices, warehouses, many streets and squares, factory buildings, all will become available for new utilization by Bolos and Ibus. Since there will be no real estate property, no laws for construction, all kinds of private restrictions, speculation, over and underutilization disappear. The Bolos can use their buildings as they like. They can transform them, connect them, paint them, subdivide them, all according to their cultural background. Nima. Of course, problems can arise, conflicts over which Bolo gets which buildings, and space in general. These problems can be discussed and resolved in the framework of large communities, neighborhoods, cities, even regions, where every Bolo is represented by its delegates, see Tega, Vudo, Sumi. Even if there are serious disputes, nobody can claim control over buildings he or she doesn't actually use. Contrary to today's property system, this can prevent most abuses. The Bolos won't primarily be interested in building new structures, but in using existing ones in new ways, and in reusing all those construction materials that have been abundantly accumulated in many places. The Bolos will prefer local materials, since the transportation requires valuable energy and labor. In this context, forgotten know-how can prove very useful and should be revived. Construction with clay, adobe, palm leaves, wood, reeds, etc. Construction methods are also linked to the energy system of a given Bolo, e.g. for passive solar energy, installation zones, greenhouses, heating and cooling. The international architectural style of steel, glass, and concrete is very energy consumptive and inappropriate for most climates. The same is true for standardized one-family houses, particularly those forming dull and wasteful suburban sprawls so lacking in communal or cultural function. New utilization of such buildings or neighborhoods by Bolos are problematic, but still possible by means of certain adaptations and modifications. Multi-story buildings can be partially topped off with terraces for planting and provided with glass greenhouses to reduce energy loss. The colder northeast or northwest sides of large buildings can be closed off in harsh winter weather or used as storage spaces or workshops. Heating will require too much energy. Between the stories of adjacent buildings, stairs can be built in order to connect rooms to larger households. Kana. Suburban one-family houses can be connected by arcades, intermediate buildings, communal halls, and workshops, and be condensed to Bolos. Other houses will be torn down to make space for gardens and to get necessary building materials on the spot. As all Bolos can express their cultural identity in their architecture, the actual monotony of many neighborhoods will disappear. The urban areas will become lively and manifold again, above all because the division between downtown areas and suburbs will disappear. There will be no distinction between cultural and merely reproductive neighborhoods. At any time, even at night and on Sundays, some Bolos will possibly stick to such perversities as weeks, months, or years. There will be Ibus in the streets, at the corners, in the courtyards. With the regular workday gone, general periods of rest will also disappear. There are no stores, except for the neighborhood market, sadi, and therefore no opening hours or empty streets. The Bolos are always open. Nesting in variety, the need for permanent transformations and adaptations to changing cultural identities will give the cities a rather chaotic, medieval, or oriental image. We'll be reminded of the times when they used to be lively. Improvisation, provisional structures of all kinds, a wide diversity of materials and styles will characterize the architecture. Tents, huts, arcades, overpasses, bridges, towers and turrets, ruins, hallways, etc. Everything will be very common, since different parts of the Bolos should be reachable without exposure to the weather. Adjacent Bolos may opt for common institutions. Walking will be the most frequent form of travel. On the whole, there will be more space for the Ibus than the present permits. Immense warehouses and commercial spaces will be available, and a lot of space will be in common use. Every Ibu will find room for its workshop, studio, exercise room, library, laboratory. The distribution of living space cannot be regulated by laws. For example, every Ibu is entitled to 40 square meters. Since needs are determined by cultural backgrounds, certain lifestyles require dormitories, Others require individual cells. Others group rooms, chapels, hammocks, towers, caves, refectories, many walls, few walls, high ceilings, cross vaults, long houses, steep roofs, etc. Although the real causes for many forms of social violence, mugging, rape, assaults, are not exclusively due to the anonymity of today's neighborhoods, the permanent animation of public and private spaces by local ibus may be an efficient contribution to make such acts impossible. The belows are also the condition for a kind of spontaneous social control, a sort of passive police. The disadvantage of a system that is based on personal contacts consists in being known by practically everyone, or by being recognized immediately as a stranger. You cannot easily afford to ruin your reputation. On the other hand, every below will have its own moral standards. Bete. Strictly speaking, it's impossible to define healthcare, bete, as a separate task. Illness or health are not just dependent on medical interventions, but much more on social factors, on the way of life as a whole. Bolo'bolo itself is the most important contribution to health, for it eliminates a lot of diseases that are direct or indirect effects of industrial society. Traffic accidents, industrialized mass wars, stress, and environmentally induced diseases, many occupational hazards and accidents, psychosomatic and psychological problems. Work and stress are the main cause of many diseases, and their reduction is the best medicine. The below themselves will decide on the definition of health and sickness, except in the case of epidemics. Like beauty, morality, truth, etc., the definition of well-being varies with the cultural background. If some ibus choose ritual mutilations or beauty scars, nobody will try to stop them. General distinctions between normal and crazy will be impossible. The belows will decide also on what kinds of medicines they find appropriate for the context of their own lives. Every below will be able to treat simple wounds and frequent illnesses on its own. It can set up its own below clinic and arrange a permanent team of experienced ibus who are on call. There might be special rooms for medical care, a pharmacy holding the 200 or so most frequent drugs, some beds, emergency kits, and special means of transportation. On the whole, the medical help will be faster and better than today, because nobody's left alone and forgotten. In a below, sick and healthy ibus don't live separate lives. All ibus are more or less ill or healthy. Bed patients, chronically sick persons, elderly, parturient, mentally ill persons, invalids, the handicapped, etc., can stay in their below and will not have to be isolated in institutions. The concentration and isolation of persons unfit for work, that's been our operative definition of illness, into hospitals, old folks' homes, psychiatric hospitals, reformatories, etc., is the other aspect of the weakness of the nuclear family, one that rationalizes the distinction between work and household. Even children become a problem for it. It's also possible that certain belows transform a disease or a defect into an element of their cultural identity. Blindness can become a way of life for a below where everything is specially arranged for blind persons. Blind belows and handicapped belows could also be combined, or there could be deaf, mute belows where everybody communicates through sign language. Maybe there will be crazy belows, diabetes belows, epileptic belows, bleeder belows, etc. Maybe not. Whereas belows can be largely self-sufficient in basic medical assistance, they need more sophisticated institutions for special cases. In emergencies, heavy accidents, for complicated diseases, and for the prevention of epidemics, there will be a graded medical system that contains also the most advanced medical techniques. On the level of cities, vudo, or regions, sumi, the ibus will have access to advanced medical treatment. The overall expenditures for medical care will nevertheless be much lower than today. In the rare cases of emergencies, ambulances, helicopters, and planes will be faster than under the present system, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be used. There are good chances that the ibus will be in better health than they are today, but there won't be any official medical definition for health, and longevity won't be a general value. Today, longevity is simply an official value because it means fitness for labor and long use by the work machine. There are tribes where life is relatively short, but very interesting in other aspects. In other cultures where long lives are important cultural values. There are simply different conceptions of life, different calculations between adventure and length. Some are more interested in risk, others in tranquility. There can be belows for each. Nugo. The Nugo is a metallic capsule an inch and a half long and a half an inch in diameter, secured by a twist combination lock, whose 7-digit number is known only by its bearer and may be his or her best friend. This metallic container encloses a pill of an immediately deadly substance. Every Ibu gets its Nugo from its below, as is the case for Taku. The Ibu can wear its Nugo together with the keys to its property trunk on a chain around its neck so that it's always ready for use. Should the Ibu be incapable of opening the capsule and swallowing the death pill, due to paralysis, injury, etc., the other Ibus are obligated to help it. If the Ibu is sick of Bolo'bolo, of itself, of Taku, Sila, Nima, Yaka, Fasi, etc., it can always feel free to quit the game definitely and escape from its improved, reformed nightmare. Life shouldn't be a pretext that justifies responsibility towards Bolo'bolo, society, the future, or other illusions. The Nugo reminds the Ibu that Bolo'bolo finally makes no sense, that nobody and no form of social organization can help the Ibu in its loneliness and despair. If life is taken too seriously, it equals hell. Every Ibu comes outfitted with a return ticket. Pili. If the Ibu decides to stick around, it will enter into a variety of forms of communication and exchange with its surrogate fellow Ibus. It will blink at them, talk to them, touch them, make love to them, work with them, tell them about its experiences and knowledge. All these are forms of Pili: communication, education, exchange of information, expression of thoughts, feelings, desires. The transmission and development of knowledge and cultural identities is itself part of such a cultural background. Nima. Every culture is at the same time its own pedagogics. The function of cultural transmission has been usurped by specialized state institutions such as schools, universities, prisons, etc. In the belows, there won't be such institutions. Learning and teaching will be an integrated element of life itself. Everybody will be a student and a teacher at the same time. As the young Ibus will be around the older ones in the below workshops, kitchens, farms, libraries, laboratories, etc., they can learn directly from practical situations. The transmission of wisdom, know-how, theories, styles will always accompany all productive or reflective processes. Everything will be disturbed by learning. With the exception of the basic Bolo'bolo terms, there won't be compulsory literacy. No 3 R's. The below certainly can teach reading, writing, and arithmetic to their young Ibus if they consider it necessary to their culture. It might be that certain belows develop special pedagogic passions and skills so that young Ibus from other belows can go there and learn certain matters. Or, if there's enough consensus in the neighborhood or a city, a kind of school system can be organized. But all this will be completely voluntary and differ from place to place. There will be no standardization of school systems, no official programs. On the level of more specialized and larger enterprises, regional hospitals, railroads, electric power plants, small factories, laboratories, computer centers, etc., knowledge can be acquired on the job. Every engineer, doctor, or specialist will have some apprentices and deal with them on a personal level. Of course, they can arrange special courses for them and send them to their other masters, or specialized belows. Knowledge will circulate freely and on a practical, personal, voluntary basis. There won't be standardized selections, grades, diplomas, titles, etc. Everybody can call him or herself doctor or professor if it's their wish to. In order to facilitate the circulation of knowledge and know-how, neighborhoods or larger communities can organize centers of cultural exchange, markets of knowledge. In such reciprocal academies, everybody could offer lessons or courses and attend others. Former school buildings or lofts could be used for such purposes and be adapted by adding arcades, colonnades, baths, bars, etc. In the buildings there could be theaters, cinemas, cafes, libraries, etc. The menu of such academies could also be part of a local computer information pool, so that every Ibu could also find out where it can get what kind of training or instruction. As the Ibus have a lot of time at their disposal, the scientific, magical, practical, and playful transmission of capabilities will expand considerably. Expansion of its cultural horizon will probably be the main activity of the Ibu, but it will be without any formal character. The disappearance of centralized, high-energy, high-tech systems will also make superfluous, centralized bureaucratic formal science. But there's no danger of a new dark age. There will be more possibilities for information and research. Science will be in the reach of everyone. Traditional analytic methods will be possible, among others, without having the privileged status that they have today. The e-boos will carefully avoid dependency upon specialists and will use processes they master themselves. As is the case with other specialties, there will be certain belows or academies, Nima Sadi, that become famous for their knowledge that can be acquired there, and which will be visited by e-boos from all over the world. Masters, gurus, witches, magicians, sages, teachers of all kinds with big reputations, Munu, in their fields will gather students around them. The worldwide rules of hospitality, Sila, encourage this type of scientific tourism, more than can be done under today's allowances. University will become universal. Communication in itself will have a different character under the conditions of Bolo'bolo. Today it is functional and centralized, hardly oriented towards mutual understanding, horizontal contacts or exchanges. The centers of information, TV, radio, publishing houses, electronic data pools, decide what we need in order to fit our behavior to the functions of the work machine. As the present system is based on specialization, isolation, and centralization, information is needed in order to prevent it from collapse. News originates in the fact that nobody's got the time to care about happenings in his or her own neighborhood. You have to listen to the radio to know what's happening just down the block. The less time we've got to care about things, the more information we need. As we lose contact with the real world, we depend on the fake, surrogate reality that is produced by the mass media. At the same time, we lose the ability to perceive our immediate environment. By its intensive internal interactions and mutual exchanges, Bolo'bolo reduces the amount of not experienced events, and therefore, the need for information. Local news doesn't have to be transmitted by newspapers or electronic media, because the e-boos have enough time and opportunities to exchange them orally. Chatting and gossiping on the street corners, at markets, and workshops is as good as any local newspaper. The type of news will change anyway. No politics, no political scandals, no wars, no corruption, no activities by states or big companies. Since there will no longer be any central events, there will no longer be any news about them. Few things will happen, i.e. the everyday media theater gets displaced from the abstract media machine into the below kitchen. The first victim of this new situation will be the mass press. Not only does this medium permit little two-way communication, letters to the editors are just alibis. It causes a big waste of wood, water, and energy. Paper information will be limited to bulletins of all kinds, to proceedings of neighborhood or city assemblies, dala, and to reviews. The freedom of the press will be given back to the users. There might be more reviews being published irregularly by all kinds of organisms, belows, writers, collectives, individuals, etc. The role and the use of books will change too. Mass book production will be drastically reduced, because fewer copies will be needed to fill below libraries. Even if there were a 100th scale print run, the access to titles by individual e-boos could be better. With below libraries, an immense waste of wood, work, and time can be avoided. The single book will be of better quality and its value will be more esteemed. It will be more than just a source of information to be thrown away after use, as paperbacks often are. Purely technical or scientific information that should be available everywhere and instantly could be stored in electronic databanks and printed out as needed. The book as an object will become once again a work of art, as in the Middle Ages. In certain belows, there will be calligraphic studies and illuminated copies and manuscripts will be written. As other specialties, they will be exchanged as gifts or at markets. Bolo'bolo will not be an electronic civilization. Computers are typical for centralized, depersonalized systems. Belows can be completely independent from electronics, for their autarky in most fields doesn't require a lot of exchange of information. On the other side, the existing material and hardware could also be used by the belows for certain purposes. Radio, television, computer data pools, and networks are energy efficient and permit a better horizontal contact between users than other media. Local cable TV networks, radio stations, video libraries, etc. can be installed by local organisms and remain under the control of the collective users. When electronics is used by Belows, very little material is needed. There will be few parallels to the case of underused home computers today. A few factories, 1 or 2 per continent, could produce the necessary equipment and manage the exchange of parts. Already at this moment, there's a computer terminal for every Below on the planet. No more production is necessary. The telephone network could also be completed in such a way that every Below could have at least one station. This means that it could be connected with regional or planetary processors or databanks. Of course, every Below would have to decide on the basis of its cultural background whether it needs such means of communication or not. As physical transportation will often be slower, less frequent, and of lower capacity than today, an electronic network of communication could be quite useful. If you want to contact a Below, you could just make a call, so every Ebu could reach virtually every other Ebu. Such a network of horizontal communication will be an ideal complement to self-sufficiency. Independence doesn't have to become synonymous with isolation. For the Belows, there's little risk of becoming dependent upon technology and specialists. They can always fall back on their own expertise and personal contacts. Without Belows and relative autarky, computer technology is just a means of control by the centralized machine. Quick and extensive information can mean additional wealth for the Belows, i.e. access to a larger variety of possibilities. Single Belows can call different menus from a data bank. That is, they will know how to get certain goods, services, or know-how at a reasonable distance, and with the required quality. Hence, gifts, permanent contracts of exchange, trips, etc., all can be easily arranged without any need of money. Kene. In the contacts with other Ebus and Belows, there might arise certain agreements on common enterprises, not only exchange of information, but also the organization of common work. For every Below, it will be voluntary to join such enterprises, but of course, Belows who choose not to cooperate will have no right to automatically participate and take advantage of them. Social organization is a trap. In Bolo'bolo, the price of being caught in this trap can be kene, external compulsory work. Common enterprises like hospitals, energy supplies, electricity, peak technologies, medicine, the protection of the environment, the means of communication, the water supply, mining, mass production of selected goods, big technologies, refineries, steel mills, purification plants, shipbuilding, airplane construction, etc., require a certain number of Ebus ready to do such work. It's probable that most Ebus can be found on a voluntary basis, i.e., they might even realize their productive passions in such enterprises. On the other side, this sector will be drastically redimensioned and entirely determined by the will of the participating communities. Ships don't have to be built. The pace and quality of work will be defined by those who do it. There are no wages or bosses. There's no hurry or profitability. The industrial undertakings of the Belows, towns or regions, no longer anything like private enterprise, will be a relatively lame, harmless, low productivity affair, and no longer so repulsive for those Ebus engaged in it. Nevertheless, it's reasonable to organize some industrial plants or centralized institutions on a larger scale. A middle-sized, carefully planned and ecologically equipped steel factory is much less polluting than a melting furnace in every Below court. So, if a certain number of Belows or other communities should decide to put up such middle-sized enterprises, and if it shouldn't be possible to find enough Ebus inclined to do such work, what can be done? There might be a rest, and this rest work, kene, could be distributed among the participating communities and declared compulsory. In return, they would get the goods or services they produce for free. The amount of kene, social or external work, depends on the situation. Most traditional societies are acquainted with this system, and in times of crisis, or when the economic system collapses, they return spontaneously to it if they're not hindered by state intervention or property limitations. It's imaginable that a Below could give 10% of his active time, i.e. 50 Ebus per day for some hours, to common work in the township. This community, Tega, could pass over 10% of its labor to the city, Vudo, and so on up to planetary institutions. Inside the Below, there could be a system of rotation or other methods, depending upon custom and structure. The rest of the work will be mainly unqualified, dull, but somehow necessary tasks, ones that probably don't fulfill any personal vocation. For the Ibu, as an individual, even work as consented to can't be compulsory. It can always leave, change its below, or try to get its below out of such agreements. This will all be a question of reputation, munu. I mean, doing compulsory work could ruin someone's reputation. Tega. On the basis of communication, pili, and common activity, kene, larger communities than belows are possible. The forms of such confederations, coordinations, or their below clusters will be different from region to region and continent to continent. Belows can also exist alone, in the jungle, or in groups of 2 or 3. They can have rather loose arrangements, can work together closely, almost state-like. There can be overlappings, temporary agreements, enclaves and exclaves, etc. One basic possibility for 10 to 20 belows is to form a tega, a village, small town, a larger neighborhood, a valley, a smaller countryside area, etc. A tega can be determined by geographic convenience, urban organization, cultural or historic factors, or simple predilection. A tega, let's call it a township, will fulfill certain practical tasks for its members: streets, canals, water, energy plants, small factories and workshops, public transportation, hospital, forests and water, depots and materials of all kinds, construction, firefighters, market regulations, general help, reserves for emergencies. More or less, the belows organize a kind of self-administration or self-government on a local level. The big difference in such forms in actual societies, neighborhood councils, block communities, soviets, municipalities, etc., is that they're determined from below. They're not administrative channels of a centralized regime, and that the belows themselves, with their strong independence, limit the power and possibilities of such governments. The township can also assume, if the belows want it, social functions. It can have organs to deal with conflicts between belows, to supervise duels, to found or dissolve uninhabited belows, organize township belows, for Ibus that cannot find a common lifestyle, but nevertheless would like to live in a below. In the frame of the township, public life should be constituted in such a way that different ways of life can coexist, and that conflicts remain possible but not excessively enervating. In the township, other forms of life outside the belows should find their space of living: hermits, nests of nuclear families, nomads, bums, communities, singles. The township will have the task of arranging the survival of such people, helping them conclude agreements with belows concerning work, food, social activities, resources, etc. A township will organize as many common institutions as the participating belows wish: swimming pools, ice rinks, mini opera houses, theaters, ports, restaurants, festivals, parties, racetracks, fairs, slaughterhouses, etc. There could also be township farms on the basis of common work. In all this, the belows will take care not to lose too much of their self-sufficiency to the township. The first step in a central state is always the most harmless and inconspicuous. Dala and Dudi. One of the problems of social institutions, even when they fulfill the best and most innocent functions, is that they tend to develop a dynamic of their own towards centralization and independence from their constituencies. Society always brings the risk of the return of the state, of power in politics. The best limitation of such tendencies is the self-sufficiency of the belows. Without this, all other formal democratic methods must fail. Even the principle of delegation from below, systems of rotation of seats, publicity, the right to full information, delegation by lot, etc. No democratic system can be more democratic than the material, existential independence of its members. There's no democracy for exploited, blackmailed, economically weak people. Given the autarky of the belows, certain proposals that could minimize the risk of statehood could be made. Inside the belows, there can't be any rules, for their internal organization is determined by their lifestyle and cultural identity. But on the township level, and all higher levels, the following procedures could be reasonable. Of course, the belows of every township will find their own system. The township affairs are discussed and put to work by a township assembly, Dala, to which every below sends 2 delegates. Additionally, there will be 2 external delegates, duties, from other assemblies. The below delegates are appointed by lot, and half the delegates must be of the male sex, so that there is no overrepresentation by women, who form the natural majority. Everybody participates in this casting of lots, even children. Of course, nobody could supervise and enforce such a system. It could only exist as an agreement among the belows. The township assembly, Dala, chooses two duties among its members, also by lot. These external delegates will be sent by another system of lots to other assemblies, other townships, counties, regions of another level and another area. So a township in Lower Manhattan will send its observers into the assembly of the region, Idaho. The assembly of Dutchess County would send observers into a township assembly in Denver. The region of Chihuahua, Mexico, would send observers into the assembly of a county in Texas, etc. These observers or delegates have the full right of vote and are not bound to discretion. Indiscretion and interference in foreign affairs are in fact their task. Such observers could destroy local corruption and introduce totally extraneous opinions and attitudes. They disturb the sessions. They could prevent assemblies from developing isolationist tendencies and regional egoisms. Additionally, the assemblies of all levels could be limited in time, election for 1 year only, by the principle of public meeting, by transmission on TV, by the right of everybody to be heard during sessions, etc. The delegates of belows would have different statuses and would be more or less independent from instructions by their belows. Their mandate would be more or less imperative. It depends on what kind of below they represent, if it's more liberal or more socialized. They're also responsible for the execution of their decisions. This is another limitation of their bureaucratic tendencies, and their activity can be considered a kind of compulsory work, kene. The Dalas of all levels cannot be compared to parliaments, governments, or even organs of self-administration. They're just managing some local interstices and agreements of the belows. Their legitimation is weak, their independence low, their tasks locally limited and merely practical. They should rather be compared to senates or houses of lords, i.e. meetings of representatives of independent units, a kind of feudal democracy. They aren't even confederations. The belows can always boycott their decisions or convoke general popular assemblies. Voodoo. The belows will solve most of their problems alone or in their townships. But at the same time, most belows will have farms or other resources beyond township limits. To arrange such things, a larger coordination of townships could be convenient in many cases. 10 to 20 townships could organize certain tasks in the frame of a voodoo, small region, city, county, valley. The size of such a county would have to be very flexible depending on geographic conditions and existing structures. It will represent a functional living area for about 200,000 ibus, or 400 belows. There would be very little transportation going beyond a voodoo. Agriculture and fabriculture should be geographically united in this level, self-sufficient up to 90% or more. Inside a county, it should be possible for every ibu to travel somewhere and to return the same day, and still have time to do something. In densely populated areas, this could be a surface of 50 by 50 kilometers, so any ibu could get around by bicycle. A county could have the same type of tasks as a township, just on a higher scale. Energy, means of transportation, high technologies, an emergency hospital, organization of markets and fairs, factories, etc. A specific task of counties should be to care for forests, rivers, mountain areas, moors, deserts, areas that don't belong to any below, that should be used commonly, and that need to be protected against damage of all kinds. A county would have more tasks in the field of agriculture, especially when dealing with related conflicts between belows. Who is going to get what land? A county can be organized around a county assembly, voodoo de la. Every township assembly could send 2 delegates, chosen by lot. Some counties will have to be of larger size to deal with cities of several million inhabitants. These megapoly pose a special problem, for their urban belows will have difficulties becoming self-sufficient in food. The approaches to this problem will be manifold. First, the large cities should be thinned out, so that unities of not more than 500,000 people can be formed. In certain cases, and for historically interesting cities, New York, London, Rome, Paris, etc., This cannot be done without damaging their typical image. In this case, these super counties have to conclude special agreements with surrounding counties or regions concerning the exchange of food versus certain cultural services, theater, cinema, galleries, museums, etc., for several regions. On the other side, the outer townships of such cities could reach full self-sufficiency, and thinned out areas could at least guarantee a partial food supply for the downtown areas. Sumi. The autonomous region, Sumi, is the largest practical unity for Bolos and Ibus. Such a region can comprise an indefinite number of Bolos, townships or counties, maybe about 20 or 30 counties, or several million people. In special cases, this could be more, or even just several thousands, as in the case of isolated communities, on islands, on mountains, in the ice, or on the desert. There are several hundred regions in the planet. Most of them will be known within the same continent. A region is principally a geographic unity, a mountain area, a region between two large rivers or mountain chains, a large island or peninsula, a coast, a plain, a jungle, an archipelago, etc. It is a unity mainly as far as transportation and getting around is concerned, and it should have enough resources to be self-sufficient. Most exchange and most communication of the Bolos will be within the limits of such a region. It is not an administrative, but an everyday life, practical unit. In certain cases, it corresponds to actual states, the US, or republics, the USSR, to duchies, provinces, official regions, Länder, etc. But in many of these cases, these areas are purely administrative and unpractical. In some cases, they've been created in order to tear apart or crush existing regions based on cultural, historical, or other identities. Regions are in fact not only geographic areas. In some case, this might be sufficient. There are cultural unities, like Bolos. There might be a common language or dialect, a history of common struggles, defeats or victories, similar lifestyles, housing forms, religions, institutions, dishes, etc. All this, and some accidents, can form a kind of regional identity. On the basis of such identities, a lot of struggles in all parts of the world have taken place in this century and before. The Irish, American Indians, Basques, Corsicans, Igbos, Palestinians, Kurds, Armenians, etc. The cultural identity of a whole region might be more diversified and less typical than the one of a Bolo. It can still be strong enough to strengthen a community. Of course, regional identity can never be a pretext to suppress Bolos and their identity. No region should expel a Bolo, and every adjacent Bolo should be free to choose its region. History has demonstrated that autonomous regions not deny their own independent culture are very tolerant towards other cultural identities too. In fact, the self-sufficiency of its Bolos is a real strength of an autonomous region. By losing Bolos or townships and winning others, a region can continuously adapt to changing situations. There are no hard borders that always cause unnecessary conflicts and wars. A region is not a territory, but a living area changing with life. In the form of typical Bolos, every region has many embassies in other regions. Irish Bolos in New York, Bronx Bolos in Paris, Sicilia Bolos in Burgundy, Basque Bolos in Andalusia, etc. Such flexible regions are also a possibility for solving all those problems that have been caused by absurd national borders. The existing nation's shape for the purpose of control and domination will be diluted in the mass of soft regions. Specific practical tasks for regional assemblies could be guarding shut-down nuclear installations or deposits, the maintenance of some railroads, boat lines, airlines, computer centers, laboratories, energy exports and imports, emergency aid, help for Bolos and townships, taking care of conflicts, participating in continental and planetary activities and institutions. Resources and personnel needed for such purposes can be delivered in the form of common work by counties, Bolos, or townships. Regional assemblies can have the most differing forms. A convenient solution could be the following: 2 delegates from each county, 40 delegates from 20 Bolos chosen by lot, about 60 members. This system would prevent the discrimination of minority cultures. Also, cultures that are not typical to a region would be represented. Additionally, there would be 2 observer delegates from other assemblies and 2 delegates from each adjacent region. Thus, in the Regional Assembly of New York City, there will be fully entitled delegates from New Jersey, upstate New York, Connecticut, etc., and vice versa. By means of such horizontal representation, the cooperation and mutual information exchange for regions could be encouraged, and they would be less dependent on superior levels. Several regions could as well form cooperating groups or alliances, especially in the field of transportation and raw materials. In Europe, in a loosely geographic sense, there could be about 100 regions. In the Americas, 150, in Africa, 100, in Asia, 300, and in the rest of the world, 100, about 700 regions in all. ASA. ASA is the name of the spaceship Earth. The autonomous regions can be considered the different rooms of the spaceship, and most of them might be interested in joining the Planetary Assembly, ASA de la. Every region will send for this purpose 2 delegates to its meetings, taking place alternating between Quito and Beirut, each year respectively. The Planetary Assembly is a forum for the regions for contacts, chatting, encounters, exchange of gifts or insults, concluding new agreements, learning languages, having parties and festivals, dancing, quarreling, etc. Such a planetary assembly or specialized committees could take care of some of the planetary hobbies, such as the use of the seas, the distribution of fossil resources, the exploration of space, telecommunications, guarding dangerous deposits, intercontinental railroads, airlines, navigation, research programs, the control of epidemics, postal services, meteorology, the dictionary of a planetary auxiliary language, Asa Pali, etc. The proceedings of the assembly will be broadcast worldwide, so that all regions know what their delegates or others are talking about in Beirut or Quito. Of course, somebody should ask those 2 cities whether they'd like to be host of such a crowd. A planetary assembly and its organisms can only do what the participating regions let them do. Whether they take part in it depends on their own interests. Any region can retire from planetary organisms and do without its services. The only basis of the functioning of planetary enterprises are the interests and passions of the regions. When agreements are not possible, there are problems. But due to the multiple networks of self-sufficiency, the situation should never become dangerous for a single region. In this regard, factors like the reputation of a region, its historic connections, its cultural identity, personal relationships, will be as important as practical deliberations. Nobody knows what practical really means. Planetary institutions will have very little influence on the everyday life of belows or regions. They will deal with a certain amount of leftovers that cannot be dealt with by local communities or that have no influence on any single region at all. Seas, polar areas, the atmosphere, etc. Without firmly established self-sufficiency for the regions, such a world confederation would be a risky experiment and could become a new form of domination, a new work and power machine. Buni. The most common and frequent form of exchange of things between ibus or communities are gifts. Buni. Things or time for mutual help, services are not necessarily scarce, and the best way to deal with its abundance is waste in the form of gifts. As everyday contacts will be intensive, there will be many occasions for gifts. Gifts have many advantages for both taker and giver. As the one who gives something determines its form and quality, it's a kind of personal cultural propaganda, an expansion of his or her identity onto others. A gift will remind the user of the giver, and so benefit the giver's social presence, reputation, and influence. The exchange of gifts reduces the work invested in the exchanging process. Since they're independent from their value, you don't have to make those calculations. Labor time. You can give spontaneously. No time is needed for complicated bargaining or agreements for return. The circulation of gifts can be compared to the rules for hospitality. Giving tends to be profitable in the long run, much more than quick, impersonal acts of buying or selling, because you forget easily the face of a supermarket cashier. There's no social advantage in such a transaction. In a relatively closed, local, and personalized frame, gifts will be the ideal form of exchange of things. This could be extended to the whole process of communication. Words are also gifts, but of course, some people count them. The importance of gifts will depend on the local situation. Since they tend to be spontaneous, irregular, unreliable, Such Bolos insisting on reliability and stability would use other, more conventional forms. Some cultural backgrounds are less compatible with fluctuations, others more. Mafa. The Mafa is a socially organized system of gifts. Its basic idea is that a common pool of reserves and resources can give participating individuals and communities more security in case of emergencies, catastrophes, temporary setbacks. Such a pool can be organized by townships, counties, etc. to help the Bolos in moments of crisis. A township, Tega, would have depots of basic food, cereals, oil, milk powder, etc., fuels, medicine, spare parts, clothing, etc. Any Bolo could get such goods when it needs them, independently from its own contributions. Common pools are a kind of net under the Bolos, should self-sufficiency fail. This kind of common reserve of distribution according to need is in fact similar to today's systems of social security, pensions, insurance, etc. So Mafa is a socialist face of Bolo'bolo. Such systems bear the risk of creating dependencies on central bureaucracies, and thereby weaken communities. But in the case of Mafa, such social mutual help would be directly organized by those who can get it. It would be under local control, and its size would be determined by Bolos, townships, etc. Any abuse would be impossible, since help is always given in material forms, never in the form of money. Help from common pools will be particularly important in the early period of Bolo'bolo, when the damages of the past, our present, will have to be repaired. In the first place, there will be many Bolos without problems, since they are just beginning to build the basis for self-sufficiency. So free material help can solve the problems of transition, particularly in the third world. Pheno. Most Bolos will need or desire a large variety of goods than they can produce on their own. Some of these goods or services might even be needed on a regular, long-term basis, and for this reason simple gifts or help from common pools would not be appropriate. For this kind of regular, permanent, and mutual exchange, the Bolos will conclude barter agreements. Pheno. Barter agreements complement self-sufficiency and reduce work, since less specialization with a Bolo is needed, and since certain large-scale production units are more efficient and even less detrimental to the natural environment. They will be used for the exchange of necessary, basic, and permanently needed goods, like foods, textiles, repair services, raw materials, etc. The number, importance, and type of such agreements will vary according to Bolo's inner organization and its cultural background. Cultural, personal, or other relationships will determine the choice of a partner much more than purely objective categories, like the terms of trade, quality, and distance. To make the system of barter agreements more flexible, computer networks could be used. Offers could be stored in data pools, which could be consulted by others who are looking for a certain product. Quantity, quality, and optimal transportation could be calculated automatically. Such local or regional barter systems could help avoid temporary over- or underproduction. With the help of more sophisticated programs, the computer could also produce prognoses and foresee impending shortages. It could make planning possible, but of course the Bolos or other participating communities still decide on their own whether or not they wish to connect to such a system, and whether they'll accept the computer's recommendations. With time, the barter agreements will form a well-balanced, tightly knit, and reliable network of exchange that can also continuously be adapted to changing circumstances. To minimize transportation expenditures, this is one of the main limitations of the system. Exchanges of large quantities or high frequencies will be concluded among nearby Bolos. If a Bolo has 500 barter agreements, 300 could exist with adjacent Bolos or Bolos of the same township. Adjacent Bolos could also be so intensively connected that they'll form bi-Bolos or tri-Bolos or Bolo clusters. The more distant a Bolo partner is, the more refined, lighter, and less frequent will be the goods concerned. From far distant Bolos, only typically local specialties and low quantities will be exchanged, e.g. caviar from Odessa, bourbon from Louisville, tea from Sri Lanka, etc. Barter agreements can also exist between townships, counties, or even regions, and there can also be vertical agreements between Bolos and townships. Extra township agreements will be coordinated in order to avoid parallel transport of identical goods. Sadi. Gifts, Common pools and barter agreements combined with self-sufficiency drastically reduce the need for economic, i.e., value-calculating exchange. The diversity of cultural identities destroys the basis for mass production, hence also the emergence of mass marketing. The invested amount of labor time will be difficult to compare. An exact measurement of exchange value through money will be almost impossible. Nevertheless, it might occur that certain ibus, they still have the property container, taku, or belos, could be interested in this type of calculated exchange for certain purposes. This is the function of local markets, sadi. These markets complement the possibilities of exchange, determining a small part of the existential basis of belos. Under these conditions, the circulation of money is not dangerous, and it can't develop its infecting effects. Money will remain a means only in a narrow frame. Most townships or counties organize daily, weekly, or monthly markets. Regions hold periodic fairs. The townships or cities establish special halls, in form of factory buildings, warehouses, or hangars, etc., for their markets, so that they can be held in winter or when it rains. Around the markets, a whole series of social activities like bars, theaters, cafes, billiard halls, music halls, etc. may develop. The markets will be, as the bazaars, meeting points, spaces for social life and entertainment. Markets are at the same time pretexts for centers of the communicative function. Markets will be organized and supervised by a market committee, Sadi Dala. These committees will determine, according to decisions of the respective assemblies, what goods can be brought to the market and under what conditions. Markets are ideal for non-essential, easily transportable, rare, durable, and highly sophisticated products. Such goods will often have a unique character, will be individual constructions, specialties, delicacies, drugs, jewelry, clothing, leather goods, works of art, rarities, curiosities, books, programs, etc. If you need such items, you cannot depend on gifts, and they're not appropriate for long-term barter agreements either. If there's a computer data bank, it might be possible to get them by using the electronic market. As there won't be any international currencies, local markets will have their own non-convertible money, or maybe chips like a casino. The single buyers or sellers will enter such a market without any money and open a credit account at the office of the market committee. Again, an easy arrangement through the use of computers. So they would get 100 or 1,000 shillings, florins, pennies, dollars, ikus, pesos, rubles, etc. that they owe the market bank. With this money, they can buy and sell until the end of the market in the evening. Then they return their chips, and a positive or negative balance is recorded under the name until the next day, etc. These balances cannot be transferred to other markets. The accumulation of too big balances, fortunes, can be made difficult by programming a random element into the computer, one that cancels all accounts and periods between, say, half a year and 2 years. This would be a kind of electronic potluck, or Hebrew jubilee. Since there is no justice apparatus able to punish breaches of contracts, any kind of business would be very risky. All this doesn't completely ban the circulation of money, because the ibus could still take refuge in gold or silver. In isolated townships, the local currency could circulate without any problems. It's self-sufficiency and other forms of exchange that keep money in certain limits, as was in the case in the Middle Ages. Fasi. Is the ibu a settled or nomadic being? In its imaginary history, it appears as steppe horseman and as a builder of cathedrals, as farmer and as gypsy, as gardener and as globetrotter. The belows presuppose a certain degree of settledness because of agriculture, and a society of pure hunter-gatherers will only be possible when the world population is drastically reduced to some million ibus. Nevertheless, Bolo'bolo should bring back to every single ibu free movement across the whole planet. There won't be any forced settledness for nomadic belows or gangs, no programs of modernization and industrialization. A single ibu only feels comfortable when it can be sure that it can leave at any moment for Patagonia, Samarkand, Kamchatka, Zanzibar, Alaska, or Paris. This will be possible because all belows will be able to guarantee hospitality to any traveler, sila. There won't be lack of time, no ibu must be afraid of lack of money, so travel can be more leisurely. Today's immense waste of energy can be reduced because traveling won't be a question of getting as far as quickly as possible. You won't need charter flights in order to visit South America or West Africa for just 3 weeks. Travelers won't be stressed tourists. The Bolo'bolo system of transportation and traveling, FASI, will be oriented towards eliminating transportation of mass goods and commuters by means of local production and living and working in the same township. Commuter traffic, mass transportation, tourism will all disappear. The major means of transportation will be used primarily for people who enjoy traveling. Traveling is a pleasure in itself, and there is no substitute for it. But Lettuce hardly enjoys a trip from California to New York. Since most of the Ibu's activities take place in the Bolo or township, most changes of place by Ibus can be achieved on foot. The townships will be pedestrian areas with many passages, bridges, arcades, colonnades, verandas, loggias, paths, squares, and pavilions. Unhindered by traffic lights, since there's almost no car traffic, the Ibu will get around with as much ease and more simply than it can today, and wherever it wants. And above all, with little stress. Up to the limits of the county, the bicycle will be the ideal means of transportation. To this purpose, townships or cities can organize bicycle pools. In combination with an Ibu, the bicycle is the most energy advantageous means of transport. Fuel is delivered to the Ibu in the form of food, anyway. Yet this means a well-organized system of small roads to be maintained. In mountainous areas, during bad weather, and in winter, it is impractical. When there's enough snow, the Ibu can get around on skis. In mountainous areas and in the country, animals are very efficient, particularly when their fodder grows right by the side of the road. Horses, mules, donkeys, yaks, ponies, camels, oxen, dogs, elephants, etc. Also in cities, horses and mules, less fastidious as to nutrition but requiring more handling experience, can be used in certain conditions, especially for transport between town buildings and the agricultural bases of a below, when too the fodder wouldn't have to be brought to town for them. But in the city itself, the Ibu is the ideal means of transportation. The bicycle can also be used for transportation of small goods, particularly in the form of rickshaws or trailers. A pentadem can transport 5 persons and an additional 350 kilograms of cargo. Compared to the bicycle, even such means of public transportation as trolleys, tramways, or subways are relatively expensive, since they need an elaborate infrastructure, tracks, cables, and wagons. But it could still be reasonable for an urban area to operate a reduced network, especially when electricity is locally or regionally available. In a middle-sized city, 3 transversal lines would be sufficient, since you could reach all belows within an hour using a bicycle from the stop of such a tramway or bus network. The street system, maintenance of which is very labor-intensive, pouring asphalt or concrete, fixing potholes, etc., can be reduced so that there is only one road to every below or farm. Most roads in the cities will be superfluous, and most country roads and highways can be narrowed to 1 or 2 lanes. The remaining automobile traffic will be slow and unimportant. There will still be some true A's, operated with biogas, steam, wood, or gasoline, some buses, ambulances, fire engines, and special transports. Some motorways can be used as racetracks for entertainment. A 200-kilometer or 120-mile highway could be reserved for such purposes. At both ends, car parks, where you could choose a fast sports car. Without any speed limits, the drivers could then drive back and forth between the 2 ends of the speedway. So those Ibus who like driving fast and who use the car as a means for entertainment and risk could still do it. Such a speedway could be less costly than today's car traffic, in spite of expenditures for gas, ambulances, medical care, car maintenance, etc. If the Ibu wants, it can get by bicycle from Cairo to Luanda, from New York to Mexico City, from New Delhi to Shanghai. But it could also take local and regional means of transportation operated by counties and regions. In many cases, these will be slow, railroads that aren't terribly frequent and that stop at every station. There will also be navigation on canals and along coasts. There will be buses. What kinds of connections are available will depend entirely upon the regional communities and the geographic conditions, deserts, mountains, or swamps. In an average region, you would possibly not find much more than 2 lines of public transportation. When an Ibu wants to travel far, it'll go to the nearest station of the intercontinental railroads, which are operated by a commission of the Planetary Assembly, Asad Allah, and which form a kind of backbone of continental transportation. This transcontinental railroad network can be based on existing tracks, with only a few supplementations and adaptations. To make traveling more comfortable, the Russian broad track could be introduced. With the transcontinental railroad, the travelers can basically get from east to west and from north to south, from Helsinki to Cape Town, from Lisbon to Vladivostok, from Anchorage to Rio Gallegos, and from New York to San Francisco. Where the tracks end, the travelers can board ocean steamliners, Vladivostok to San Francisco, Lisbon to New York, etc. For sea transportation, energy problems are unimportant. Coal, petroleum, etc. can be easily transported on the ships themselves, and sails could be used additionally. The Planetary Assembly or regional coalitions will operate international airlines too. They are important for distant islands, for deserts, for jungles, in polar regions, etc. There will be much less need for flights than today. And flights are, after all, in most cases, too expensive with respect to fuel and infrastructures. The lack of many of these will not be a real disadvantage, since traveling will be a quick means to an end, but an entertainment in itself. There will be enough planes for urgent transport, ambulances, medicines, spare parts, funerals, etc., as all Ibus will be able to travel, not only the rich ones like today. Tight personal relationships between distant Bolos will develop. New ideas will spread easily. Friendships, love affairs, pregnancies, projects, fancies, and cultural identities will link them. In spite of the relative slowness of traffic, planetary exchange will be more intense and generalized than today. The Ibus from different continents will deal with each other on the same level. Tourism will be inverted. Bantus in Berlin, Quiche Indians in Peking, Mongols in Paris, Tamils in Detroit, etc. The planet will become a mutual anthropological museum. Yaka. Is the Ibu a good-natured, love-starved, nice being? Or is it quarrelsome, reserved, and violent? Is it only aggressive because the nightmare of work and repression has made it envious, frustrated, and irritable? This might be true, and yet there might be jealousy, offended pride, destructivity, antipathy, lust, and murder, megalomania, obstinacy, aggressivity, towering rage, running amok. At least such desires cannot be excluded at the outset. That's why Yaka will be necessary for Bolo'bolo. Yaka makes possible quarrels, disputes, fights, and war. Boredom, unlucky in love, stories, madness, misanthropy, deceptions, conflicts around honor and lifestyle, even ecstasy can lead to Yakas. They can take place between Ibus and Bolos, between Bolos and Bolos, between regions and Ibus, between Tegas and Ibus, between Bolos and Tegas, etc. Like other forms of exchange, in this case of physical violence, Yakas, fights, can be regulated by certain common agreements in order to limit danger and risk. It will be one of the tasks of the township assemblies and county committees to help the Ibus and Bolos maintain the Yaka Codex. A formal challenge must take place in the presence of at least 2 witnesses. A challenge can always be refused. The respective assemblies must be invited to try for reconciliation. The choice of weapons and of time for the duel belong to the challenged. The type of armor is part of the weapon. The duel must take place in the presence of a delegation of the respective committees. The respective Yaka committee provides the weapons for both parties. As soon as one of the parties declares itself defeated, the fight must stop. Weapons whose range is greater than the ability to see the white of the enemy's eye are prohibited, around 100 yards. Only mechanical weapons, the body, sticks, maces, swords, slings, spears, arrows, axes, crossbows, or rocks, are permitted. No guns, poison, grenades, fire, etc. The duel committees get the weapons, arrange the battleground, organize referees, armed if necessary, take care of transportation and medication for wounded or dying, protect bystanders, animals, and plants. If the larger communities, counties, Bolos, or townships, etc., get into fights, the competent duel committees might be forced to considerable efforts. Damage caused by fights must be repaired by the challengers, even in the case of victory. Duels will almost never be linked to winning material advantages, since they're very costly and since the parties will be obliged to live together afterwards. Most motivations for duels will therefore be in the field of emotional, cultural, or personal contradictions. They might serve to diminish or increase someone's reputation, munu. In the case of prevalent nonviolent ideologies, diminish. It's impossible to predict how frequent and how violent or how extended yakas will be. They're a cultural phenomenon, a way of communication and interaction. As they involve many material and social disadvantages, wounds, damage, ruined reputations, they might prove to be the exception. But duels and fights are not games, and cannot simply signify the acting out or sublimation of aggressivity. They cannot be considered a kind of therapy. They're serious and real risks. It is even possible that certain cultural identities would have to die without permanent or periodic fighting. Violence continues, but not necessarily history.